entitled Thomas Merton on Simplicity of Life and its Lessons for Sustainability. I'm dedicating this lecture to the Sisters of Mercy in the Portland area who are celebrating 150 years of service here. So I want to dedicate this lecture to them. For anyone who might not know me, I'm Sister Marilyn Sunderman, a Sister of Mercy. I've been here 21 years at St. Joseph's College. Currently, I'm chairing the department, the theology department. I had chaired it for 12 years and then took some time off. And here I am again, back at the same type of work. Gladly. I needed to add that. So let's settle in for this lecture, which lasts about 45 minutes, if my timing is correct. I've offered each of you a PowerPoint that you can follow, and the PowerPoints go horizontally. So the second one is entitled Simplicity. Does everyone see that? So you can follow along as I project as the lecture moves on. In the 19th century, such notables as Henry Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Bronson Alcott conducted experiments in simple living. In the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi lived simply in order that others might simply live. During the same century, Thomas Merton sought to embrace and live out the Cistercian monastic charism of simplicity of life, which is rooted in the rule of St. Benedict. According to Merton, the very essence of Cistercian simplicity is the practice of charity and loving obedience and mutual patience and forbearance in the common life, which should be on earth an image of the simplicity of heaven. I'm behind here in my slides. That's the quote that I just read, taken from The Spirit of Simplicity, written by Merton. In the 12th century, Bernard of Fontaines, later canonized as Saint Bernard, born of a noble family and well-educated, sought to revive Benedictine simplicity of life in its purest form. He restored the monastic life at the Abbey of Citeaux, France, and later established a monastery in Clairvaux, France, where he became the first abbot. It was from the foundation in Clairvaux, that the Cistercian Trappist monastery in Kentucky, where Merton lived for 27 years, was later founded. As a Cistercian monk, Thomas Merton studied, wrote about, and sought to live out St. Bernard of Clairvaux's understanding of simplicity. According to Merton, St. Bernard's teaching on simplicity of life is valid for all Christians, not simply for Cistercians. Merton's in-depth study of St. Bernard's writing enabled him to become an accurate commentator on the various aspects of the mystical theologian's teaching regarding simplicity of life. In his theology, St. Bernard situates his discussion of simplicity within the context of each person being created in God's image and likeness. For St. Bernard, a person's divine image consists of his or her natural simplicity and inborn freedom of will. Reflecting on St. Bernard's teaching, Merton notes that when Adam and Eve fell from grace, their pride was the birth of sin and the immediate ruin of human simplicity. Duplicity, doubleness in self, then concealed each person's natural simplicity. In order to reinstate the original simplicity of being created in God's image, one must turn to God, begging God for that grace and infused charity that will enable the person to purify his or her soul of duplicity. Merton explains that according to St. Bernard, in order to reach the desired return to one's original natural simplicity, one must first develop simplicity in the sense of sincerity. That includes the awareness of one's shortcomings. Next is simplicity in terms of humility, which involves self-acceptance as one dependent upon God for all things, especially one's very existence. Regarding this form of simplicity, Merton indicates that it entails developing a sense of asceticism as one strives to rid self of everything that is useless, unnecessary to one's end, that is, the recovery of the divine image and union with God. According to Merton, in this regard, St. Bernard stresses the importance of simplicity of food, clothing, lodging, work, and manner of life as described in the Benedictine rule. For St. Bernard, a further form of simplicity is that of the interior senses and the intellect of a person that calls for simplicity in studies, prayer methods, liturgical matters, devotions, and church decorations. Regarding intellectual simplicity, St. Bernard stresses that the one thing necessary in life is knowledge and love of God, and that the only way a person can truly know God is by loving God. Accordingly, as St. Bernard indicates, there is also the matter of simplicity of will that manifests itself in one's embracing the common will, that is, the good of all. For Cistercians, simplicity of will includes both obedience of the monk to his abbot, who in monastic life is considered Christ's representative, and submission to one's brothers in community. Regarding monastic obedience, Merton reflects, I quote, "If we want union with God, let us obey our superiors and give in to one another, and seek to do what is profitable to others, not what happens to suit our own pleasure or convenience." End of quote from Merton's book, Thomas Merton on St. Bernard. Merton further asserts that simple obedience is always generous enough to do what is required of it, and with a good heart. According to St. Bernard, a person who embraces a life of simplicity is able to progress to the experience of union of his or her will with God's will in a marriage of love. In this union, which St. Bernard describes as a kiss, the person who is immersed in God has no other interests or desires but those of God. In such a mystical marriage, wherein one experiences being one with God in love, the person participates in God's uncreated and utter simplicity. According to St. Bernard, such a union is the crown of human love of God in earthly life. Furthermore, St. Bernard notes that in such a mystical marriage, the person loves God for God's self alone. God's life becomes the person's life. The person desires only God and delights in all that pleases God. In his teaching, St. Bernard stresses that it is cooperation with God's love, drawing one to God's self, that enables a person eventually to experience mystical marriage with God. According to St. Bernard, only relative union in love with God is possible on earth, whereas a more complete experience of such a marriage can take place only in heaven. In either case, St. Bernard maintains that the experience of mystical union with God includes both satisfaction and desire not totally fulfilled, and results in the person's deeper awareness of his or her responsibility to care for others. During his life as a Trappist monk, Thomas Merton strove to live out the Cistercian charism of simplicity of life. As a member of his monastic community, Merton embraced an asceticism embodied in a daily regimen of personal and communal prayer, a meatless, modest diet, and the wearing of the Trappist garb. Merton also experienced the ascetical discipline of teaching, study, and writing, and in humility was obedient to his abbot. In his final years as a hermit, Thomas Merton took up residence in a cinder block dwelling on the monastery property. There, life simplified for this monk, who for so long had yearned for deeper solitude. In the hermitage, Merton developed a daily routine of prayer, study, some writing, preparing and consuming simple meals, washing dishes, and cutting wood. In the greater silence of his lodging in the woods, Merton sought mystical union with God. There, Merton's close encounters with deer, birds, frogs, trees, ponds, rocks, and other elements in his surroundings drew him into a more intimate relationship with their Creator. Delight in each of these creations that honors and praises God simply by being what it is moved Thomas Merton to write about humans' profound responsibility to care for all that the deity brings into and sustains in existence. Also during the latter part of his life, Thomas Merton became very interested in the community called the Shakers. In order to better understand what Merton learned about simplicity of life from this group, it is important, first of all, to become acquainted with this celibate sister and brotherhood. Anne Lee, the daughter of a blacksmith, joined the Shaking Quakers in England when she was 22 years old. In 1774, guided by spiritual visions and signs, Anne led 8 people to the United States, where she began the American Shaker community. This tiny band of believers was determined to live simply, sharing everything they owned. By the 1850s, the Shakers had grown to comprise approximately 6,000 members in 19 communities stretching from Maine to Kentucky. Individual Shaker communities were subdivided into families of 50 to 100 members who wove their own clothes, grew their food, fashioned their furniture, shared work, and together sought a deep spiritual life. The Shaker lifestyle of material and spiritual simplicity and hard work aimed at bringing its celibate members closer to God. In Shaker villages, buildings were modest, unadorned, and plain. Every building was designed to be simple, useful, and sound. Shaker room furnishings evidenced painstaking workmanship, functionalism, and simplicity in conception and execution. Shaker furniture was truly a work of art, an expression of simple design in wood, a celebration of the very grain of the wood. Devoid of ornamentation, Shaker clothing was never designed for fashion. An individual Shaker's clothing occupied a drawer or two in a retiring room in the dwelling house. This quote is taken from Shaker Life, Work and Art by June Sprigg and David Larkin. Retiring rooms, they write, were typically furnished with a chair and a narrow bed for each occupant, a wood-burning stove, a strip of carpet, a washstand, looking glass, and towels, a few brooms and brushes, and little else, end of quote. In Shaker dining rooms, place settings on tables were simple and there were no decorative table linens. Shared meals were considered gifts from God and were eaten with gratitude. Simplicity was essential to Shaker worship. Shaker hymns, sung during worship services, were considered inspired gifts of the Holy Spirit. In simple rhymes, Shakers were able to convey to each other complex ideas and understandings, and the beautiful, uncluttered melodies added an emotional current that gave the words additional force. The Shakers viewed music as religion in song. Shaker songs were very singable. Thousands of songs were composed and sung by Shaker brothers and sisters. One song sung everywhere in the Shaker Society, written by Elder Joseph Bracken, is Simple Gifts. You've probably heard this song. I can't sing it, but I'm going to read it. 'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right. A song that originated in the New Lebanon Shaker community is, I will bow and be simple. I will bow and be free. I will bow and be humble, yea, bow like a willow tree. Another song, reflective of the Shaker commitment to leading a simple life, is, I want to feel little, more simple, more mild, and more like a child, more thankful, more humble, more lowly in mind, more watchful, more prayerful, more loving and kind. Dancing was a part of Sabbath worship in the Shaker community. In 1794, the Shakers abandoned the whirling, shaking, and leaping of the first Shakers in favor of a simple, uniform dance that all believers could practice as one, stepping forward and back in perfect unison. Employing simple, shuffling steps, the Shakers labored, moving their hands and their feet in organized movement. The Shakers viewed their dancing as sacred and productive of blessings. Dancing filled the Shakers with heavenly joy. It made love and union flow. Thomas Merton's connection with the Shakers included his experiences at the Pleasant Hill Shaker community, also known as Shakertown, located near Lexington, Kentucky. His friendship with Edward Deming Andrews and his wife, Faith Andrews, and Merton's own study of this communal religious group. In a history of the Trappist community published in 1949, Thomas Merton described the Shakers as, quote, quiet, sober, hardworking men and women who segregated themselves into communistic communities of their own, where they lived in celibacy, practiced their religion, and supported themselves by farming and various crafts, end of quote. In the last decade of his life, Merton was able to visit the Pleasant Hill Shaker village, which had become a kind of museum, since no Shakers were living there any longer. Referring to one of his experiences at Pleasant Hill, Merton journaled, "The old Shaker colony at Pleasant Hill is a place that always impresses me with awe and creates in me a sense of joy. I love those old buildings, and I love the way the road swings up to them. They stand there in an inexpressible dignity, simplicity, and peace under the big trees." After another visit to Shakertown, Merton entered the following reflection in his journal, quote, "How the bland side of a frame house can be so completely beautiful, I cannot imagine. A completely marvelous achievement of forms," end of quote. From Merton's journal, Turning Toward the World, the Pivotal Years. After the Shaker simplicity of life was what most attracted Merton to this celibate community. According to Merton, the Shakers and the Cistercians were born of the same spirit. In a letter to Edward D. Andrews, Merton wrote, quote, "I am deeply interested in the thought that 100 years ago, our two communities were so close together, so similar, somehow in ideals, and yet evidently had no contact with one another. I feel all the more akin to them because our own order, the Cistercians, originally had the same kind of ideal of honesty, simplicity, good work for a spiritual motive." Merton's interest in the Shakers included his desire to write a book about this mysticism in practice, as evidenced by the Shakers' life and their craftsmanship. However, before he was able to complete this project, Thomas Merton died of accidental electrocution in Thailand. For Merton, the exquisite beauty of Shaker craftsmanship silently witnessed to this group's simplicity of life. Sometime after Edward Andrews passed away, in a letter to his wife, Faith, Merton reflected, quote, "I realize more and more the vital importance of the Shaker gift of simplicity, which is a true American charism, alas, not as fully appreciated as it should be." End of quote. Merton recognized in both the Shakers and the Cistercians a lifestyle centered in the rhythmic interplay of prayer, work, and study. Both communities looked upon work as a sacred endeavor, a participation in God's ongoing work of creation, entered into for the praise and the glory of God. Both groups also shared a commitment to peaceful living and the sharing of goods in common. The motto, "Hands to work and hearts to God," that Shaker foundress Ann Lee coined, is applicable to both the Shaker and Cistercian way of life. Referring to this motto, Thomas Merton noted, in regard to his monastic community, that, quote, "Well, of course, this is normal for us. You work and your heart is lifted up to God while you are working, and you are working for God. Now, to work for God means your work is your union with God. Ideally speaking, whatever a person is doing, his or her work is union with God. End of quote. According to Merton, simplicity characterized the Shaker and Cistercian architecture. Merton describes Cistercian architecture as famous for its energy and simplicity and purity, for its originality and technical brilliance. The typical Cistercian church, with its low elevation, its plain bare walls, lighted by few windows and without stained glass, achieves its effect by the balance of masses and austere, powerful, round or pointed arches and mighty vaulting. These buildings fill anyone who enters them with peace and restfulness and disposes the soul for contemplation in an atmosphere of simplicity and poverty. Similarly, Shaker buildings are spacious, devoid of ornamentation, and evidence an economy of structure and lines. Merton viewed the Shakers as an authentic American form of the monastic life. The original community of believers sought to return to a life of pure simplicity, just as the Cistercians did when they came into existence. The desire to live in utmost simplicity served as the foundational principle of each of these Cenobitic communities. According to Merton, Cistercians have deep respect for land. Describing the early Cistercians, Merton comments, "When the monks had found their homes, they sank their roots into the ground, and they fell in love with their woods. Indeed, this love of one's monastery and its surroundings is something integral to the Cistercian life." End of quote. From Merton's text, The Waters of Silo. The Shakers also have evidenced deep appreciation for land, the land where they have dwelt. They have tended their surroundings with care and have been deeply grateful to God that their agricultural endeavors have yielded fruit for daily sustenance. It can be said of both Shakers and Cistercians that they have considered land a sacred gift of God and have sought to relate to and steward it in a deeply reverential way. Commenting on Shaker chairs, Merton noted that the peculiar grace of a Shaker chair is due to the fact that it was made by someone capable of believing that an angel might come and sit on it. According to Merton, each time a Shaker craftsman began work on a new chair, the craftsman did it as if it were the first chair ever to be made in the world. That is a quote from Merton's introduction to the Andrews text, Religion in Wood, and it's found also in Seeking Paradise, a text that Dr. Paul Pearson has published about this. Thomas Merton understood that for the Shakers, all their creative endeavors, including chair making, were undertaken in a true spirit of humility, with the goal of proper order and functionality. Commenting on Shaker craftsmanship, Merton described it as wordless simplicity, in which the work of quiet and holy people speaks humbly for itself. The Shakers' superbly simple creations testify to their belief that they viewed themselves as intermediaries for God's bringing something new and beautiful into existence. In our contemporary world, there are many individuals who are attempting to live according to the spirit of simplicity Thomas Merton found embodied in the Shaker and Cistercian traditions. Like Merton, these persons are cognizant that adopting such a lifestyle entails rejecting the Western cultural values of undue consumption and excessive accumulation of goods, that is, the acquisition of more and more things, a phenomenon that has been called thingification. Like the Cistercians and Shakers, these individuals' desire to live more simply is religiously motivated. Their search for simplicity of life is grounded in God, who is utter simplicity. They recognize that in order to more perfectly reflect God, who dwells within them, they need to align their lives with God's simplicity. They wish to uncomplicate their lives, which they realize is not easy to achieve in a society that lives and breathes an ideology that more, and even more is better. For these people, voluntary simplicity entails focusing on what is essential in life. It entails decluttering their lives and deliberately reducing wants in order to stress that life is about being rather than having. In so doing, they create more space for God in their lives. Richard Foster, a Quaker, describes this process as freeing oneself from, quote, intoxication to material or outward things and becoming sensitive to things of the spirit, end of quote from his text, Freedom of Simplicity. Like the Shakers and Cistercians, non-monastics who embrace simplicity in contemporary society know that humility is essential to doing so. As humble persons, they live in the truth of their dependency on God for life itself and for all that is needed to sustain it. They rejoice in the genius of God's incredible creativity, demonstrated in the diversity of human and other living and non-living forms on earth. Those who internally embrace an ideology of simplicity express it outwardly and in their ways of being and acting as temporary earth residents. These persons' practice of simplicity, nurtured by their ongoing listening in silence to the voice of God, enables them to become strongly committed to responsible stewardship of God's gift of all of creation. Practitioners of Christian simplicity focus on wholeheartedly loving God. They live life from the center, who is God. They lovingly share what they have with neighbors in need of basic necessities. They understand that compassionate justice necessitates sensitive global awareness of and response to those in various parts of the world who go to bed hungry every night or who die of malnutrition and related diseases, especially women and children. Those who embrace simplicity of life know that their personhood is not identified with possessions or position. Just as for the Shakers and Cistercians, for such persons, gone is the need to strain to get ahead. For them, as for their monastic counterparts, work which is cooperative rather than competitive is a means of contributing to the common good. Those who choose to live according to the spirit of simplicity modeled by the Shakers and the Cistercians often engage in activities such as daily meditation, gardening, recycling, consuming natural foods, wearing clothes until they are worn out. They purchase products that are durable, repairable, functional, and non-polluting. As already indicated, their simplified way of life is reflected in their strong sense of social responsibility in relationship to all members of Earth community. The simplicity of life that Thomas Merton wrote about and embraced as a Cistercian monk, and also discovered embedded in Shakerism, provides a path for securing a sustainable Earth in the 21st century and beyond. A primary sustainability principle is that the earth is sacred and has been entrusted to humankind by a loving creator deity. All living and non-living earth components constitute an interrelated and interdependent whole. Each component uniquely contributes to the common good of life on earth. The divine being desires the flourishing of all of creation. Thus, humans have a profound obligation and responsibility to reverence and care for all of Earth's life forms. In his writings, Thomas Berry, one of the foremost contemporary commentators on the Earth story, stresses that sustainability of Earth community demands that humans undergo a conversion from egocentricity to ecocentricity. According to Berry, the preservation and enhancement of the integral Earth community of living and non-living components must become humans' primary concern. Such a commitment entails humans shifting from an extractive, non-renewable economy to an organic, ever-renewing one. For this to occur, humans need to renounce their view that Earth is a resource for their unlimited, exploitative use. For Thomas Berry, it's imperative that humans become a benign, life-giving presence in relationship to all Earth cohabitants. In effect, such a presence will involve humans embracing the kind of simple lifestyle modeled by the Cistercian and Shaker communities as interpreted. This has led me, the simplicity of life, and I had this idea about a year ago about the connection that I thought could exist between simplicity of life and sustainability. Now I'm finding the Pope referring to it in his sustainability encyclical, and I haven't even touched in this paper all the writings that there are about Thomas Merton's environmental vision. Dr. Monica Weiss, who is a highly recognized Merton scholar, has published a book on this topic. She was here years ago when we had a Merton conference at this college. And there are many nature writings in Thomas Merton's journals. And he became quite aware of the environmental issues of our day. And if he had lived longer, I am sure he would have written more about this issue. He wrote about some of the social issues of our time. The Vietnam War was happening. He wrote out against it. Nuclear question was before us, more than it seems to be today. He wrote about that. He became a social prophet, as it were, in his time. I think if he were here today, he'd be really speaking out about this issue of our time, which the Pope is saying that it's the most important issue of our day. And yet it's so easy to not think of it as for me. How about you? The most important issue of our day, most important moral issue. I'm not so sure many people understand or even think about it that way. Some more questions or comments? Yes, Frank.
Today is the memorial of St. John Paul II, and in his World Day of Peace message, I believe it was 1990, he said the ecological crisis is a moral crisis. And in the encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis takes that even deeper and says it's a spiritual crisis. Every time I think he uses the word crisis, but it takes it into an interiority. And I really appreciate the remarks today and bringing that together with Thomas Merton and the Shakers. And I think that's really the answer. It's each one of us interior.
The interesting thing about the Shakers is probably most of us in this room know that there's only one community continued in existence, and it's out at Sabbath Day Lake, New Gloucester, Maine. There are only 3 Shakers in existence. A couple of ladies and a gentleman. The gentleman is a lot younger. He's in his 50s, I think, and the 2 women Shakers are in their 70s. One is in her 70s, one is in the 80s. However, it's interesting. Shakerism will go on, no matter what. If those three people, if no one comes into the Shaker community to become an official member, there are thousands of friends of the Shakers all over this country. And they will continue the spirit and tradition of Shakerism in their own lives. Any other questions or comments? Well, it's certainly been my pleasure to, there is an announcement. Yes, Frank has it. We're going to do that and then we'll be finished.
You'll be watching posters and emails. The college is sponsoring a interreligious dialogue at USM on Tuesday, November 10th. This evening will be a band for students or anyway, who like to go. And again, that will be
What is the topic?
third. It's on interreligious dialogue in the time of conflict. The title is Beyond Nostra Aetate, which is the Vatican II document 50 years ago that addressed interfaith relations. And the three speakers are coming from California, from Boston, and from, I believe, Georgetown University. A rabbi, a bishop, Catholic bishop, and a Muslim imam.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, and thank all of you for being here this evening. It's been delightful to present this material to you, and have a good evening.